lot of misconceptions about Maroons. Typically in literature, whites will say that the Maroons were uncivilized, they were unorganized, they were lewd, they were barbaric. These were the people who lived in the bush.
There is no other group on the planet Earth that have taken on the devil the way we have, in his own house.
Some estimates say that there are about 50,000 Maroons that you can find per year throughout the Americas.
The Great Dismal Swamp was an area between that Virginia, North Carolina, the eastern border area. This was a popular area for a lot of not only runaways, but natives. A lot of the black natives hung out there. The Gullah Geechee were known in that area.
Because that's who we are. You can put us anywhere in the world. We are survivors.
If you are really tapped in with your environment, you become one with that ecosystem, right? You know what I'm saying? That ecosystem begins to work with you.
We were robbed of our definition of who we were, which is our nationality and our tribe. And we fell into the description of what we were from someone else's eyes.
Resistance is not just about not only violence and physically fighting back, but there has to be resistance literature, resistance language.
A whole 2 detachments of U.S. soldiers got mowed down by the Black Seminoles. They destroyed an entire U.S. military force. Out of 110 people, they killed 108. That's damn good shooting.
The Black Seminoles were using all types of guerrilla warfare tactics, and these warfare tactics are studied in military schools to this day.
They didn't like Muslim slaves. The same reason they didn't like Indian slaves, because they weren't afraid to die.
Once you realize you're not safe, your children and your families aren't safe, the people who you're bringing in the world are not going to be safe long after you, there becomes a need to stand up and survive at all costs.
We are the Maroons. We are today's Maroons. We are the force that's moving forward. We will never be stopped.
For the last 200 years, we've been given one image of what a Native American is. But when you look at the archaeological and scientific evidence and historical records, you have to ask the question, who were the real Aboriginal people of the Americas?
Native ancestors, who were not Asiatic, by the way, that's another fantasy. When the Asiatic came across the Bering Strait, the African was already here. The Asiatic and the African engaged in an internecine warfare for nearly 10,000 years before the European got here. And they brought their Asian disease and killed off a lot of our people in that meeting.
They weren't the ones that migrated over the Bering Straits, that came via the Mongols. Who you see here were the Asian Mongols. They came over here as not only migrants, but as conquerors. The indigenous people were copper-toned Moors, they call them Moors, but they were the copper-toned so-called blacks that everyone knew about and that were actually crisscrossing before to Africa and back again.
And so that is why you will see Luzia, who is an African woman. You can see her face. And there are other African finds that can show, and they can date them 10,000, 15,000 years ago.
We found one of the oldest skeleton remains, the bones of Luzi, Luzia, in Brazil. And up until 2018 in the National Brazil Museum, they had a display of her that was done by Richard Nevis. And he said, without question, this is a Negroid face. This is a Negroid skeleton.
Not only were Black Aboriginal people here in the Americas, there's also evidence of other Black people coming from Africa doing trade with the Aboriginal people here, like Abubakari II.
They believe that Abubakari and his crew landed somewhere in Brazil. And as you know, Brazil has the highest population of Africans outside of the continent. I also want to mention that Dr. Ivan Van Sertima in 1987, he presented evidence to the Congress to suggest, not even evidence to suggest, but evidence to prove that there was contact between the Native American people and African people.
Genetic studies, in particular for Brazil, where they trace the original inhabitants of at least South America to people who came via boat from Africa, Australia to South America on the first humanoids on what you call this hemisphere.
We can all thank the Twa Mbuti for our presence here. Had they not done what they did, we wouldn't be here today. They populated the world about 100,000 years ago. There is evidence of a woman found in San Diego, California. Her bones are about 80 to 90,000 years old. When you look at the California, named after Queen Khalifa, it was an African woman. So that when we're looking at these migrations, when we're looking at the people here, people came in waves. And the first wave is going to be the Twa Mbuti. The second wave is going to be what's called the Clovis Folsom people. Clovis Folsom are going to be found in Clovis Folsom, New Mexico. McJunker, African American, who was an archaeologist, anthropologist, found these bones.
Ruins, Burroughs Cave in Peoria, Illinois. They found that cave to have inscriptions. There were steles inside of the cave that had ancient Kemetic inscriptions, along with Hebrew dialect on some of the steles.
Dr. David Imhotep has done tons of studying on this subject. He even wrote a book called The First Americans Were Africans. And basically, he has found tons of findings on this exact subject matter. There are Egyptian writings throughout the Americas. There's evidence of artifacts and Algonquin writings throughout the Americas as well. There are even Egyptian writings in the Grand Canyon.
We see that there's evidence that there were black people in Africa, and even going back to ancient Kemet, trading with the Aboriginal people here in the Americas. In ancient Kemet, they would come over here and they would trade medicine. They found that there are mummies from ancient Kemet that had traces of cocaine in their system. The reason why they would use cocaine was for medicinal purposes, for anesthesia, things of that nature. But cocaine is not found anywhere in Africa. Cocaine is not found anywhere in the Eastern world. Cocaine is really found here in South America, Peru, Colombia, places like that. So them finding cocaine in the ancient mummies over in Kemet is more proof that there was contact between the two societies.
You have Esmeralda and Guayaquil and other communities in Ecuador. You've got Cauca, you've got the Pacific Coast, Choco, you've got that for Colombia where the people had their own communities. You had Panamanians had their own kingdoms, black, as early as the 1520s.
You know, there's so much evidence that proves that there were black people in the Americas centuries before Columbus. You have the artifacts, you have the Olmec statues that's down in Central America. You have so many eyewitness accounts that prove that black people were here in the Americas centuries before Columbus. When Columbus came here, there's a reason why he brought a lot of black translators with him, because they understood in Spain that there were black people here in the Americas exploring, doing trade with the Aboriginal people here, and also the Aboriginal people of the Americas were originally black. The black Aboriginal people were here before the red Mongolian Native Americans. So black people have always had a presence in the Americas.
You also have a German, Russian, European painter, I believe he was, Louis Corus. He went out to the San Francisco, the Bay Area, and he painted the natives out there, and he depicts all of them as jet black, the blackest of black.
There's a white archaeologist, historian named Alexander von Wutenau. He moved from Germany down to Mexico. Von Wutenau was one of the few white men who would tell the truth about the things he would find. He found that there were so many artifacts with Africoid and Negroid faces on ancient monuments and figurines down there in Central America and here in North America as well. He wrote a book called Unexpected Faces in Americas. And in his book, he documented all of these private collections of figurines of black people that date back thousands of years here in the Americas.
The third is the Algonquin, still African, but now you have a touch of a people that were impacted by the Ice Age, but they're still an African people. Now the fourth is going to be the Inuit, derogatorily called Eskimo. And these are the people that are going to be more in the Canadian area, the North American area. And then the last migration is going to be what we call the Mongoloid invasion, who are Asians who are escaping from the Genghis Khan and others who are invading. They're pushing them down through Asia into the American continent. Those are the 5 migrations. But the first 3 are deeply embedded in the African tradition. The first migrations did not come via the Bering Strait. The first migrations came directly from Africa. Not just that, there's probably very good chance that the first human beings that populated this planet populated Brazil. Because when the Africans left the west coast of southern Africa, where you have Northwest Africa, Namibia, you have a number of countries, where they would have migrated, they would have gone on what's called the Benguela Current. And that Benguela Current, along with the wind system, would have brought them directly into what we today call the Amazon River.
So in Columbus Journals himself, he talks about talking with African seafarers who tell him of a current that they call Little River, and that if he caught this current off the west coast of Africa, it would take him to a new world. So we have evidence that Africans were coming to the Americas long before Christopher Columbus.
We've always been told that America was named after European explorer Amerigo Vespucci, but there's evidence to suggest that variations of the name America existed way before European contact.
His name was Alberigo, and up until 1505, his name is Alberigo. But we find that he's writing letters to people and he's introducing these concepts, such as the mountains, Amerisques, that's located in Nicaragua. There are an African group of people known as the Mesquite, who are the ancient peoples of this area. The same migrations that's coming to this part of the world, these are the people that are here now. They form themselves into the Mesquito.
Americua meant land of the great winds. Now, you know, everywhere you go, you see hurricanes and tornadoes. Well, our people, the autochthonous people, called it the land of the great winds. But it was the beautiful land.
Van Wootno also talked about how at the Smithsonian, they went out of their way to hide a lot of the black monuments and figurines so that the public wouldn't know about it. So he revealed a lot of the finesse games that went on when it came to hiding the black presence in the Americas.
You have a painter who comes down here by the name of P.G.F. Van Rijk, and he comes down to Georgia in 1736 and he paints the Yuchi people. He's actually a refugee in their tribe, okay? And he paints these people, the supreme commander, the chief, and all of these are jet black people. All of them are jet black people. So we see this literary evidence all over as well. Actually, you can go to the Smithsonian. They had a discovery in about, what was this, around 1939 in the Smithsonian. They published an article talking about how they found Negroid skeletons in what is now the U.S. Virgin Islands of the West Indies. Okay, this is 200 years again before Columbus. So we see this evidence all over.
In Spain, for 700 years, you had black people called the Moors who dominated Spain and southern Europe for that matter. And they brought a lot of culture, they brought a lot of knowledge and learning and enlightenment to that area. But at one point, the white supremacists wanted to take back over their continent. So they had the Reconquista.
We were always qualified by the description from the European. So you would be a Moor, which came from the Greeks Maur, and of course we adopted that name, Maur. It was a descriptive adjective. It was not who we were. That's why it was always qualified with, say, Obayid Moor, or the Chickasaw Moor, okay? We were robbed of our definition of who we were, which is our nationality and our tribe, and we fell into the description of what we were from someone else's eyes.
When the Europeans arrived to the Americas, they had some very interesting depictions of the people they saw here, and they often compared them to the people they saw in Africa, and they compared them to the Moors who occupied Spain.
They also spoke specifically of, the characteristics of the people that they encountered. They described them, very thoroughly. They said that they were melanated. They said they had Moorish attire, sashes and things of that nature, plume feathers. Everything that they were used to seeing in the Iberian Peninsula, they saw mimics of it over here.
So there's been many different waves of black people coming here to the Americas. There's evidence that you had Moorish explorers going all the way back to the 7th and 8th century, trading with people here. You have documents talking about a Moorish explorer named Ibn Said trading with the people over here in the New World. In the 10th century, there was a Moorish explorer, Ibn Farouk. There's documents showing that he was trading with a Western continent over here and taking goods and products back to the old world.
They taught them how to bathe, how to be civilized, and anything that you see in Spain today has some regiments of what the Moors brought over there.
The series of events, they were a series of battles, multiple battles that were lost throughout the Reconquista and whatnot, which happened to be about 400 to a 500-year campaign, along with the Inquisition, which was a very long campaign. So the Moors were being run down militaristically. They were winning their battles and they were losing a few. And then a lot of infighting was taking place.
So ultimately, the Moors were ruling in Spain and southern Europe for 700 years. After a while, the Moors got into a lot of infighting. There was a lot of infighting in Moorish Andalusia. There were different kingdoms that were split up. They weren't unified. While they were still being split up, the white Christian empires, they were consolidating their power. They were getting on code with each other. And they were slowly running the Moors out because the Moors would not get on code. The Moors would not consolidate their power. The Moors wanted to have all of these splintered kingdoms. And the last kingdom was the Kingdom of Grenada.
The Moors were pushed out of Europe, and particularly specifically Spain, by a collective group and effort by Europeans. It was led by Henry the Navigator, and he pushed them out of Spain, and he actually followed them into Africa. And he becomes known as one of the first European settlers who has some type of influence and actually becomes a governor in certain part of West Africa.
Spain, as we know it now, they started the modern wave of white supremacy as we know it. They were the ones who came up with the blood quantum laws and came up with these racialized policies really against the Moors. And there's always been this war against the Moors. It's been a religious war. They frame it as Christian and Moor, but it's always a real war between white and black. And that war continues now.
These Moors were successfully removed out of Spain, the Great Capitulation. There are many factors that we have to bring up that led to this eventual expulsion. We have the Reconquista, which was a concerted effort by European nation states at that time, right? Clans, families, and things, and kingdoms. The Kingdom of Aragon, the Kingdom of Castile. We have the Inquisition by way of the Jesuits.
Grenada was the last Moorish stronghold in Spain. The kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, they consolidated their power, consolidated their military, and consolidated their resources, and they finally got the Moorish stronghold out of Spain, 1492.
So the conversion was basically to drop your faith, right?
Become Moriscos.
You have to become a little more, Morisco, what they considered a little more. And for the Jews, they had to get baptized, and they had to take on anglicized names. Anglicized names, an example of that would be in history. There's stories about a Muhammad Ibn. He turns into an Alfonso. So when we read about people that we may perceive to be Europeans, they're talking about Moors or Jews, and they're anglicizing their names.
When people talk about Thanksgiving, there's many rumors and folk tales about the real origin of Thanksgiving. It has nothing to do with the Pilgrims getting with the Native Americans and them having this big feast. Many people say the real origin of Thanksgiving is in Spain in 1491, November 25th. This is when the last Moorish stronghold gave up power and turned over the keys to Grenada to the Spaniards.
The Africans are bringing a culture. Spain didn't have a culture. In 1492, when Castile and Aragon, the kingdoms of Isabella and Ferdinand, overtook Boabdil in Granada, they didn't bring anything to the table. And quite frankly, Spain has been falling out of place since then.
Many people believe that the turkey was supposed to represent the Turkish Moors. A lot of the Moors were connected to the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and the Moors had these red fezzes that they would wear and red scarves and red bandanas. And the turkey, as we know, it has a red thing dangling from its neck. So a lot of the white supremacists said that, okay, these are the Turkish Moors, and they kind of made the turkey the symbol of the Moors, according to folk legend.
Because Africans have been taken, there's two currents, the Canary currents, and then I think the other one's called the Congo currents, that's further, or the Guinea currents. And both of them will lead you to the Caribbean. One will drop you automatically in the Gulf of Mexico, and the other will drop you automatically in the Dominican Republic. Africans have been doing this for centuries on centuries on centuries. And so they told Columbus about this. Columbus take it back to, they knew they weren't going to no India, but they had to sell a package. They couldn't sell a no man's land package. So they said, we can get to India to the gold and the wealth and so forth.
And that log will go from Africa into the Caribbean without any cruise, sails, whatever, because it's the sea current. The fish do it too. You mean people who are fishermen can't do that? Nobody ever got? Of course they did.
The thing about Christopher Columbus, a lot of people believe that the Columbus voyage was a big finesse. A lot of people believe that Columbus knew he was not going to India. They knew where India was. But Columbus sold this finesse because it's easier to get money and resources to travel to a known place than to say, I want to get money and capital to go to some unknown world that we've not explored before.
One of the boats, you know, the Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, I'm not sure which one, but one of them was owned and operated by twin Moore brothers, the Pinzon brothers. And so we see that the Africans were intricately involved in everything that happened in that area.
He lied to them about where he was going. And because they feel if he's going to India, we got to guarantee gold. We don't have to worry about the Silk Road. You know, the Chinese got that under lockdown. But now he's going to help us get the same wealth without the Silk Road, without the Marco Polo thing. And he didn't produce, at least not the wealth they wanted at that moment in history. And that's why they put Columbus in prison for all those years.
So many historians believe that Christopher Columbus knew that he was going to a new land, and plus Christopher Columbus had Moorish sailors and explorers with him, and they knew where the Americas were, because when Christopher Columbus sailed off in 1492, remember, they took over Grenada. And when you take over a society, when you take over an empire, you take over their resources, you take over their knowledge, you take over their science, you take over their navigation, you take over their military. And the Spanish, they got access to those Moorish maps in 1492 because the Moors, they had a stronghold on trade. And they're not going to give up their trade secrets. They're not going to tell you where they're getting their products from. They're not going to tell you who the plug is. Once they got conquered, once they got expelled from Spain, now you got all of that knowledge. So the minute they got those Moorish maps, they hit the road.
One of the things that the Spaniards did, the Crown of Castile and Aragon, the one thing that they did was that they removed the Africans that were on the land. They removed them from the land. And the one way, it's pretty much what the British did to the Irish, moving them. In order to take the Irish land, they removed them and brought them to the United States. What they did with the Africans in Spain, they tried the same exact thing.
When Columbus and other explorers came to the Americas, they all brought black translators with them. Even up in Canada, they had Mateo de Costa. Down in South America, they had Juan Garrido. Here in the Americas, they had people like Estevanico the Moors, the Nino brothers. These were Moorish explorers. In fact, the boats that Columbus used, they were owned by Moors.
One of the most famous translators, his name is Mateo da Costa. He actually was one of the black translators who came from France, and he served as a translator for the Portuguese.
Columbus definitely brought black translators with him coming to the Americas. The Nino brothers, more specifically. Pedro Alonso Nino was well-renowned traveler and explorer.
But what's interesting is, why would Columbus bring translators? Because it meant that if he brought African translators, they must have been speaking to African people here. Because why do you need someone to interpret if you don't speak the language and they don't speak the language? So there had to have been a commonality between the two people.
But of course, you know, you get rid of all of that with Columbus, who didn't know where the hell he's going, but he had black people with him. Pizarro had black people with them. Balboa had black people with them. Magellan had black people with them. The technology for sailing, the astrolabe, all this stuff came from either the Moors or the Swahili.
When Columbus came to one of the islands and he brought one of his black translators with him, it's documented that the translator came off the boat, went into the Aboriginal society and immediately started to communicate with the Aboriginal people there. That means that there had to have been some type of previous contact for them to understand each other's language.
The migration of peoples of color into the Americas is nothing new. The Europeans came here and documented everything they saw. But of course the Vatican said, you're not going to tell the true history of North America. And all of that is hidden away in the archives of the Vatican.
Jay Chapman came to what is now Chile, Argentina area, and he painted a picture called The Male Savages of Tierra del Fuego. Okay, and these were the early Fuegans, as they call it, down there in South America. He painted them black. This was in 1795.
When Columbus went to Cuba, Columbus said on top of a mountain, he saw a mosque. So that's more evidence to show that there was not only an Islamic connection, but there was a connection with the Moors coming over here, corresponding with the people.
Explorers came and met the indigenous people. They passed Africans going back to West Africa when they were coming here. When they got here, they spoke to the indigenous here in the Caribbean, and they had a spearhead. And it was very unique because it blended different types of chemicals, and that type of spearhead could only be found in Ghana. And so it's called guanine, and that can only be found in certain places. There was trade going on constantly.
Christopher Columbus was present at said battle, or when the capitulation took place, the transfer of power took place. He was present. He was charged afterwards by decree of the Pope, and also by the crown of Castile and Aragon, Princess Isabella, Queen Isabella, and King Ferdinand, to venture forth into the Americas.
And the French and the Castilian Spanish teaming up to try to take Spain away from the Moors. Many of the Arab leaders who had gotten so wealthy and got the little kingdom, they weren't going to give that up. So they joined, them and their forces joined the Christian forces of Castile and France. And the Moors, by 1492, we were driven out. The first enslaved Africans to be brought to the Western Hemisphere during a period of slavery was the Moors, who was taken primarily to the Dominican Republic.
During the transfer of power, you have, as with any time of a siege, the Articles of Surrender, right? Basically spared the lives of certain scientists, map makers, sailors, right? So their lives were spared, their families' lives were spared, and what was offered to those who were willing to be spared was what was known as a conversion.
There was no common cold virus in the Western Hemisphere before Christopher Columbus. The common cold acted like pneumonia. They killed, I think Pizarro in one of his chroniclings had to take his ships out to sea for 30-something, almost 2 months, because the stench of the body of the native people dying from smallpox, influenza, and pneumonia.
The Hopi Indians would do a chant, and they recorded this chant in, I want to say, the 1930s, 40s, or 50s, around that time. They recorded this Hopi chant, and at the time, it sounded like gibberish. They didn't know what it was. The United States government recorded this chant, and it just kind of sounded like gibberish. And it was an ancient chant from the Hopi Indians. Later on, they found out that this chant was just not gibberish, it was actually them speaking in a broken form of Arabic. So this shows that, again, many Aboriginal people here had connections with Islamic Moors from medieval times.
When they traveled over here and they came upon land and they was greeted by the natives, and the natives had to go and get a translator. So that proves several things, right? Because you can't learn Arabic in one contact. So there had to be frequent contacts between them, between the Moorish merchants and the black natives that was over here.
When the whites moved into Alabama from Georgia, their translator was a black man. There's a monument to him on Talladega, near Talladega University. The translator's a black guy. They white people couldn't do it. Look, Lewis and Clark. Didn't they take the black dude, York, and he seemed to be able to get to the Indians and they couldn't? We're white, we own you. But they listened to the black person.
Columbus in 1484 goes down this coast. He's working with his father-in-law, who's a sailor. They built Columbus. Christopher Columbus helped to build the first slave dungeon in Africa, Elmina. The guy who navigates Columbus' ship over here is a black Moorish man, Ghanaian man by all of his names, Fanti man from Elmina.
You have accounts from the actual journals of De Soto, Columbus, and things of that nature, saying that when they got to certain places in the Americas, they witnessed the architecture that matched the architecture that they saw over on the Iberian Peninsula with the Spain's domes, domed mosques, and things of that nature.
Well, Spain actually started its conquests of the Americas in the late 15th century. They had conquered and taken over much of the Americas, with the exception of Brazil, the British colonies, which later became the United States, and just a few isolated areas in the South American continent and in the Caribbean. But they really had a large, dominant presence in the Americas.
Many Native Americans were reclassified as Negro, and they still do that to this very day. You have black Aboriginal tribes. You have the Shanticock out there in Long Island. You have the Washita down in Louisiana that many people don't talk about. These are black Native tribes that's still here, and they are not getting the federal recognition that they deserve. But we have to understand, California, we're in California now. California was named after a black woman, and there were many black Aboriginal tribes right out here in California, very well documented. In 1526, you had a Spanish explorer named Ion. And Ion was one of the first people to come to the North American continent. And this was the first time that they brought enslaved black people to the Americas. Ion most likely brought these people who are in Moorish Spain. They brought them over here, they were Moors. There's no evidence that Ion actually went to Africa to get these black people. So most likely they were already in Spain, and they were prisoners of war from the Moorish conquest. So he brought these people over here. They set up a colony in the South Carolina, Georgia area. They called it San Miguel del Guadalete. They were there for a few months.
Okay, well.
The black people rose up against the Spanish. They burned the village down, ran the Spanish out of here. The Spanish went back to the Caribbean, and then the black people blended in with the Aboriginal society here.
And so they're responsible for killing millions of people with diseases, not warfare. Now, when they write their history books and their movies, they're the gallant warriors with the shield. That's bull crap. Their diseases debilitated us.